Hello, my name is Phil Togwell, and it's an absolute delight to be joining you at the Joined Up conference. Obviously, I'm sure we would all much prefer to be together in person, having coffee and conversation together, and hopefully one day we will be able to do that. But until now, this is the best we can do. If you haven't already met me, I'm the Director of Prayer Spaces in Schools. It's been my privilege to serve prayer spaces in schools, which is part of the 24/7 prayer movement since it began. Prayer Spaces in Schools began about 12 years ago. And it's a privilege to be here talking about prayer spaces as part of the conference. I'm going to share my screen now and dive straight into the presentation. So here we go. If you're not already familiar with prayer spaces in schools, there's some social media links at the bottom of your screen. And I'd really recommend taking a note of those because there are lots of good quotes and photos available on those pages that should be of inspiration to you if you're interested in prayer spaces in schools. We spent some time as a team trying to figure out our mission statement, a kind of a short summary of what we believed prayer spaces are and what prayer spaces in schools is for. If any of you have ever spent some time trying to craft a mission statement, you will feel my pain. How long it takes to come up with a few short words, a couple of sentences, but these are ours. This is our best attempt. We believe that prayer spaces enable children and young people of all faiths and none, and this is really important, to explore spirituality, faith, and life's big questions in a safe, creative, and interactive way. This is what prayer spaces are for in a school context in particular. And as an organisation, Prayer Spaces in Schools, we believe our mission is to equip local churches to serve the ongoing spiritual life of their school communities. Prayer Spaces in Schools doesn't run prayer spaces, but we do our best to equip the local church. In a way, the ideal goal, the end goal isn't a prayer space. The end goal is this creative relationship between the local church and the school community, a serving relationship, a blessing relationship, a seeking first the kingdom of heaven relationship in a local area. And prayer spaces, we found over the years, are just a really good catalyst for that, a really good vehicle. And prayer spaces often lead on to many other things, as some of you I'm sure will have experienced, and hopefully we will see as we go through this short presentation. Prayer spaces have often led on to chaplaincy programs or a series of workshops around particular themes. Prayer spaces have led on to the strengthening of pastoral care in schools. They've led on to series of lessons, perhaps RE lessons or PSHE lessons, all sorts of things. And at a really personal level, prayer spaces have been a blessing to both pupils, families, and to staff at times. And we'll look at a few quotes as we go through this session. Here's just a few areas that prayer spaces serve in terms of the life of the school. I won't go through all of these at the moment, but smack in the middle there, one I would want to draw your attention to is spiritual, moral, social, and cultural learning. Now, all schools certainly in England and Wales are expected to provide spiritual, moral, social, and cultural learning. Now, that's not just about RE. That's not subject specific. The whole school, whether it's a church school or not, whether it's a community school or a church school, they're expected to provide a spiritual, moral, social, and cultural learning environment. It's one of the things Ofsted checks when it comes to visit school, and it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to be listed as an outstanding school unless SMSC is good within that school community. And prayer spaces are a really great way not only of providing that kind of learning environment, but also evidencing it. And that's one of the reasons why I think schools have been very open and warm towards well-hosted prayer spaces. Clearly, in a time such as this, we're all reading the news reports, we're all aware personally of the mental health and well-being issues, the crisis that is growing like a storm cloud behind us right now. This last year has been devastating for many children and young people, and I'm sure those of you who are parents like me will relate to those news stories. We know that this is the case because we see it in our own homes. We're in this strange situation where over the last year, there have been less prayer spaces hosted in schools for obvious reasons. Many of them have been closed or have been really limited. And yet the conversation certainly that we've been having as a team with local teachers that we know, it's almost like the demand is greater than ever. And our anticipation, our expectation is that over these coming months, well-hosted prayer spaces, reflection spaces are going to be so important for the sort of establishing of healthy school life again. Children and young people are going to need space to reflect and process what they've been going through, make sense of it somehow, ask their big questions, and for many to pray too. And so I think, I want to appeal to you as well, that we find ways to host prayer spaces, soul spaces, reflection spaces in partnership with our local schools. Jill Booth, who's the executive head teacher of a few schools, a trust academy trust of schools in Durham, in the Diocese of Durham, said this: no project that we've used in school has had a bigger impact on student well-being than this one. We ran a series of prayer spaces across the schools that she was involved in. The other quote I'd want to draw our attention to before we get into some photos of prayer spaces and some more detail is this from Henry Nouwen. I would imagine that many of you have read some of Henry Nouwen's books. If not his books, you will have seen quotes from his books. One of my favorites of his is The Wounded Healer, and he says this: I am afraid that in a few decades, the church will be accused of having failed at its most basic task, offering people creative ways to communicate with the source of life. If I was looking for a quote to sort of describe the essence of a prayer space in a school, it would be this: prayer spaces offer people, pupils and staff, and sometimes families too, that come and visit them, creative ways to communicate with the source of life. As a church, we have provided often wordy, cerebral, informational ways for people to try and connect with the source of life, with God. But I don't know if we're wired that way. I think at heart, we are wired in more creative, interactive, kinesthetic ways. We want to taste and see that God is good. And I think that prayer spaces offer that. So I want us to hold that quote in mind. Such a beautiful quote. And I want us to hold that in mind as we go through these next few slides. So this is a photo of Francis Bardsley School in Romford. This is the very first prayer space I was involved in November 2008. I have to be honest with you, I didn't know if it was going to work. I'm a kind of skeptic by nature. And so myself and the two Methodist ministers who I was working with, we got this all set up, and I just wasn't convinced that anyone would show up. This prayer space was only open lunchtimes. The vast majority of prayer spaces that are set up now are set up for a short period of time, usually a few days or for a week, and they're usually open for lesson times. Students will be timetabled to come with the rest of their RE class or their PSHE class or their form class or whatever it may be, to come and spend a lesson time in the prayer space. But on this occasion, it was just open for lunch times. And on that very first lunchtime, after the bell went, students started to arrive with their sandwiches and their bags and chatting away. And myself and the two Methodist ministers I was working with were soon pressed up against the walls as crowds filled this room. It's hard to believe this, but there were scores and scores of students. We think between 80 and 100 students in that first lunchtime, crammed into this one room, writing on post-it notes and sticking things on walls and trying to engage with the activities. And at the end of this lunch hour, the bell went and students filed out, and we started picking up post-it notes off the floor. And this was the very first post-it note that I picked up. There are so many things I can't forgive myself for. I pray, I ask for your forgiveness, Lord. Amen. Now, just from the language on that post-it note, I assume that that student had some kind of awareness of God, or perhaps experience of church. I don't know who wrote it, but something was going on in that student's life. And it was so close to the surface that they obviously didn't mind the fact that they were surrounded by other students. They took that moment, that opportunity to pray this desperate prayer. I can't forgive myself for what I've done. Can you, God? And for me, that was the moment that I just thought, we've got to do this. We've got to create these spaces for children and young people to communicate, to connect with the source of life, because I'm utterly convinced that God wants to reach out to them and meet them in their moments of need too. And so since that time, that was 2008, the first prayer spaces that we were aware of and began to support were in that academic year, 2007, 2008. Since then, there have been 4,500, 5,000 prayer spaces in more than 30 nations of the world. We're confident that more than 1 million children and young people have participated in a prayer space in their school. And as I say, many of those temporary prayer spaces have evolved into all sorts of other projects in the school, as well as continued with rhythms of prayer within that school. Prayer spaces can happen in all sorts of places within a school. This was a prayer space in a primary school hall a few years ago. This was a super creative one in a primary school classroom. As you can see, it's like a gazebo. I don't quite know what room this is in, but it's some sort of classroom that's been broken up with these super creative gazebos. This is a prayer space in a secondary school. This was in Colchester. Tim Abbott and the CYO team set this one up. Some prayer spaces take place outside. If the school is fortunate enough to have some sort of outside classroom, then that can be used. Some have risked actually putting the prayer spaces on the school field or in the playground or in some actual outdoor space, maybe a garden, a reflection garden, something like that. And it doesn't need to be big. There have been plenty of stories now, examples of prayer spaces that have been tucked away in small places. This one that you can see on screen is in a cupboard, and there's maybe 2 activities there. It doesn't have to be a full classroom. It could be a little cupboard. It could be one activity in the corner of a canteen or in a corridor, as is often the case in colleges or sixth form centres. It's finding creative ways to use the materials, to use the language of creative reflection and prayer in a way that engages pupils and staff as well. Obviously, over the last year, the opportunity to host prayer spaces has kind of diminished a lot, or it's required some really creative thinking. And I'm sorry about the quality of this photo, but this is a bunch of prayer spaces in a bag that some friends of ours in Stafford put together. And quite a few local churches have done this now, put in a bunch of activities in a bag and then delivered it to the school, so that students who can't share activities because of the risk of touching something that someone else has touched, and cross contamination of COVID and all that kind of thing, can still do a prayer space on their own, on the desk in front of them, socially distanced from other children and young people. And so there's been quite a few schools that have done this with the pupils that have been in the school with them. In Colchester, again, Tim and his team set up a small prayer space back in June, July time last year, when schools were back in, but they realized that they needed to clean things quickly. And so they set up a small prayer space for 5 or 6 students to come to at a time, and then the reusable activities were wiped clean before the next few students were able to come. This is a photo of a slightly hairier me. Look at that. And so a local school near where I am, here in the northeast of England, they had all of their year groups at home, and so they were broadcasting lessons back to via the Google Classroom. And so pupils at home were expected to log in and watch the videos that the teachers had produced, or to engage in live lessons online. And so one of the teachers asked me if I would record a little video, a short video explaining 3 prayer activities that they could also beam into the homes of the pupils, and ask them to do some prayer activities at home. And this is me explaining an activity to do with climbing your stairs. There are some things in life, perhaps particularly at the moment, that we find hard to overcome, to conquer, to reach the top of. And so pupils were invited to put a pair of walking shoes on, and as they climbed the stairs of their house, to think about what they are finding difficult to overcome right now, and express a hope or a wish or a prayer if they wanted to. And what was lovely was some of the pupils actually videoed themselves doing some of the activities and then uploaded it to their Google Classroom. So my reason for showing you these is just to say it is possible to host prayer spaces and offer prayer activities, whether we're in school or not. We can find ways. If it's that important, if we believe this stuff is that important, then we can find ways, whether that's creating new video resources or packaging them into a bag or a small box and delivering them to schools, or doing them in reduced size ways that can be cleaned. We can find creative ways to deliver these prayer spaces. Incidentally, over the last few months, what we've done as a prayer space in schools team is we've sort of converted probably about 50 or 60 of the prayer activities so that they can be used at home, because many of them were involved using a gazebo or a bubble tube, and there aren't many people who've got those kind of things in their living room at home or their bedroom. And so we adapted 50 or 60 of the activities so that they used everyday objects at home. And what's extraordinary is since all that went live, probably early summer last year, nearly 50,000 activities have been downloaded from our website, which is encouraging. People are making use of these prayer activities at home. Before I flick you through a bunch of photos from prayer spaces and look at some of the prayer activities and some of the prayers that children and young people have prayed, I want us just to settle on this little grid, because I think it's a really helpful way of us understanding the nature of spirituality. You may have come across this already. David Hay and Rebecca Nye did some work back in 2007 on the spirit of the child. They were looking at what is spirituality, and they came up with this grid, which kind of explores spirituality as relational consciousness. Spirituality is an earthy thing. It's part of our intrinsic nature. And so these four areas they felt were evidence of spirituality. One is to do with me, myself. How do I understand and express this flesh and blood, body, soul, spirit being? How do I kind of understand myself? There's something spiritual to my very nature, and that's a part of my spirituality. It's to do with relating to myself, how I am connected to myself. Um, it's also to do with how I connect with others. It's to do with forgiveness and reconciliation. It's to do with listening to others. Those of you who are aware of Martin Buber's work on I, it, and I, thou, and how we see the divine in others and how we receive others, we'll know that there's something profoundly spiritual about that part of our nature, our relationship with others. The third area, which I think is becoming more popular, and particularly children and young people are very aware of this, is there's something spiritual to our connectedness to the earth. It's there in in the creation mandate. God gives the earth as something to be stewarded. And so we're becoming more aware of that as we consider the climate crisis. We consider issues of injustice in the world, inequality and prejudice and discrimination. We see these big themes in the world, and that's part of our spiritual identity. Paul talks about being given the ministry of reconciliation. It's not simply about being reconciled to other people, but there's some reconciliation to the whole earth that is part of our call and our purpose as human beings. And then the fourth area, of course, is our connectedness, our relationship with God, with the divine other, with the numinous, and that's an important part of our spirituality. It's not the only part, but it is a part. And the reason for mentioning this little grid to you is because the prayer activities on the Prayer Space in Schools website, and I would say to you in all forms of prayer, fall into one or more of these categories, and rightly so, because this ministry of reconciliation incorporates all these four areas. Prayer is about becoming whole, shalom, connected, complete, and it involves all of these areas. So as we go through prayer activities, bear this grid in mind, and you'll see that they slot into one or more of them. So just quickly, let's look at a few photos. I'm aware that time is going on. Perhaps you'd assume this, perhaps you wouldn't, but in my experience of the last 12 years of prayer spaces in schools, by far the most popular theme of activities within any prayer space is anything to do with being still, anything to do with stopping, listening, being calm, being still. It's interesting, isn't it, that children and young people who are so incredibly active and distracted, largely by the digital devices in their hand, they don't seem to be able to be still. But my observation of prayer spaces over these last few years is actually children and young people are craving stillness, and so are we. I suspect some of you are nodding right now. We're craving stillness. We're desperate to pause and be still. We just don't know how to do it. We don't have any models for it anymore. We don't value it. We value busyness and activity more, and we need to rediscover stillness. We need to rediscover daily pausing, weekly Sabbathing, quarterly retreating, annually vacationing. We need to rediscover stillness, and it's no surprise that children and young people are looking for that. Usually there's some kind of activity to do with self-image. in a prayer space. And there are a few examples of this in the library, the resource library on the Prayer Space in Schools website. And this obviously falls into the first of those 4 categories, that grid that we just saw. And you'll know as parents, children's workers, youth workers, whatever your role is right now, that there is a great battle on right now for the confidence, the sense of self-love, that children and young people need to discover. The chasm between the self that they are and the self that they are being persuaded to present to the world, either in person or more frequently on social media, is becoming deeper and wider. And that's unsustainable. And so anything that we can do to help children and young people be reconciled to themselves, to love themselves, has got to be incredibly valuable. Equally, prayer activities to do with loving the world, expressing what's going on in the world, processing the anxiety and the worry that many of them feel for the world, is going to be important too. So there's a whole bunch of activities on the Prayer Space in Schools website to do with themes of justice, and whether they are, there's a series that we did in partnership with Christian Aid to do with poverty and water and all that kind of stuff. And there are others to do with people trafficking and homelessness as well. And this is a great example of a really visceral activity. The children are invited to crawl inside one of these cardboard boxes, and then the volunteer, the team member that's alongside it, would ask them to just, imagine your bedroom, imagine the comfort, just think about your bedroom for a moment. What do you like about your bedroom? And now, what if this was your bedroom? And what if this cardboard box was on a street corner? How would you feel? X thousand people today will sleep in a cardboard box, some as young as you. If you want to, why don't you write a hope or a wish or a prayer for some of those children and young people less fortunate than you on some of these cardboard boxes? And as you can see, there's lots of prayers already scribbled onto those cardboard boxes. I've got a few examples here from a school up in the Diocese of Durham. One of the children wrote, "Sad." Another wrote, "Dear God, I just want to tell you, people in different countries don't have beds, and I want you to give them a bed so they can lie down properly." That next one says, "Lonely. Dear God, help the boy in the box." I think there was a laminated picture of a boy sleeping in a box. And I like that middle one at the bottom, "Get me a pillow or a duvet." Those are the things perhaps that these children would miss the most if they were sleeping on a street. Some of the activities involve putting some headphones on and listening to a narration. And this particular one is called Forgiveness Stones. It invites the pupils, the narration invites the pupils to consider things that have been said and done to them, which they are carrying around inside them, almost like a stone. This girl is holding a stone that she's picked up from the floor in front of her. And as the students listen to the narration, they're invited, if they want to, if they feel ready to begin to let go, begin to be kind to themselves by taking a step forward and forgiving, letting go, to place the stone in the bowl of water that's just off screen, off this photo. I've sat in prayer spaces watching students do this activity and placing the stone back on the pile. And the narration gives permission for that, because that is a perfectly valid response. I don't know if I'm ready to let go of this right now. It actually feels painful to let go. It's amazing how many of those same students come back the next lunchtime or the day after that and then ask, "Hey, Phil, can I do that activity again? Because I've been thinking about it and I know I need to do this now. I know I need to let go." I've watched students weeping as they place the stone into the bowl of water. Just a little diversion here. This is a prayer space in a big warehouse in the middle of the jungle in the Congo. We had this lovely little bit of interaction with a French missionary who was running a prayer space. She said, all I've got is some paper and some plastic chairs and some branches and trees from the forest. I don't have a bubble tube or a gazebo or anything. And so this is the sum total of the materials that she had to set up her prayer space. And at the end of it, she sent us an email, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the email that she sent back, themed around forgiveness. And this is what she said. One of the activities was to pray for those who need help. And to my surprise, most of these abandoned girls, so this was a kind of like a safe house for girls who've been abandoned. They prayed for their parents who'd abandoned them. For me, it was a good lesson in forgiveness. God's love reaches the hearts of his children who have been hurt and gives them strength and love to forgive like him. I was humbled. Isn't it incredible that, bits of colored paper and plastic chairs and the invitation to reflect and pray is all that's needed for the Holy Spirit to do some extraordinary work in some really broken hearts. There's usually an activity in most prayer spaces to do with being sorry, whether that's rolling up sorry prayers and wedging them into a big wooden cross. This is probably a church school that is a bit more comfortable with that kind of imagery. In another school, it might be string hanging from the ceiling and little sorry prayers written onto pieces of card. I've got a couple of examples of sorry prayers here. Here's one. I am sorry for fighting my sister. I love the spelling on that prayer, and I'm very glad that God doesn't correct my prayers either. Not necessarily for bad spelling, but for all sorts of other badness. I think, God is okay with our frustration and our anger and our sadness. And the book of Psalms is full of all of that. David's prayer book is full of that kind of emotion, and it's okay. And one of the things that's really important, I think, about prayer space is that sense of permission to pray however we need to. This was a girl who wrote this. Dear God, I am sorry for being me. I am always amazed at how raw and honest so many of the prayers that children and young people write are, bearing in mind that it's unlikely that they are at any of these activities on their own. And so they're choosing, because there's no pressure to participate, they're choosing to write this stuff down and leave it visible for other people. This stuff, the struggle, the confusion, the worries, the fears, the anxieties, as well as the good stuff, the hopes, the gratitude, it must all be so close to the surface that all it takes is a simple invitation, some safe volunteer helpers in a room, and some creative activities for them to want to express themselves. Sometimes it's hard to know whether to have a little chuckle or to feel really sad. This is a good example. I'm sorry for not looking after my hamster properly. He died. I like the fact that this student has kind of fully disclosed the situation and popped a bit in brackets, but yeah, there you go. This activity, Thankful Ducks, this was designed by some students, and one of the things that we would definitely recommend, having already hosted a prayer space or two, once students get used to the format and the idea of prayer activities, get them designing some activities themselves, get them kind of their vested interest engaged in it. A youth worker in Bury St Edmunds called Matt Rushby came up with this simple idea for a prayer activity called the empty chair. Who's missing from the table of your life right now? Where is the empty chair for you right now? And this prayer activity has been used in loads and loads of different situations now. And as you can imagine, students write all sorts of things. Perhaps it is someone who's died. Perhaps it's someone who has moved away, a grandparent, someone who the child or the young person has loved or lost. Many children and young people, they don't know how to express their grief, their sense of loss, the emptiness, especially if they know their parents are struggling. And so activities like this can be incredibly valuable for children and young people. My personal favorite activity is big questions. Simple idea. Imagine God was sitting at the table with you right now. What would be the one big question that you would like to ask? Lots of the big questions that children and young people write are kind of head questions. They're theology, their information I don't understand about questions. So how can God listen to everyone's prayers all at once? That is a very good question. Does everyone go to heaven? That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because that could be a theological question. Does everyone go to heaven? What's the criteria for going to heaven? It might, on the other hand, be a very personal question. It might be this might be a child that comes from a church family who has a particular belief that people have to have made a personal choice, a decision to follow Jesus for them to go to heaven after they die. That might be their theology. And maybe grandma's died, maybe granddad's died recently, and maybe this child has overheard mum or dad and their sadness that grandma or granddad never went to church and didn't have faith of their own. And so this child is now troubled with this question. This isn't a head question, this is a heart question. And many of the questions that we see written on bits of torn up cardboard and on post-it notes are heart questions. They're heart cries. They're psalm-like questions, aren't they? This one, I love this. It's kind of shaking your fist. You allow wars. Why, God? If God is real, why did he let my granddad die? I think it's really important that we make space for questions, and it's really important that we don't hurry to answer them. Whenever I'm hosting a prayer space, whenever a class comes in and I'm explaining what's about to happen, and I do my little bit of introduction and welcome to everybody, and I introduce the team of volunteers from the local church who've come to help me, and I'm explaining the activities, if we are using big questions, then I'll probably say something like, look, my friend Sue is going to be over by the big questions table. Now, if when you're doing that activity, if you'd like to talk to Sue about your big question, you can do that. That's great. Just here's the thing though, please don't expect Sue to have a great answer for you. That's not because she's stupid. She's actually really, really clever. She's actually got a degree. She's been to university. She's bright, or she's actually a church leader. She knows some stuff, but she doesn't know everything. And you know what? All of the adults in the room here, we have big questions too. And sometimes we don't know what the answers are. So it's possible that your big question is also Sue's big question. And in which case, perhaps you could have a chat about it. And I would also then say to my team, or I would have previously said to my team, please don't rush to try and give easy answers to difficult questions. It's okay to let questions linger. Why? Because Jesus did it. Jesus did it all the time. Jesus rarely answered questions in a straightforward way. Why? Because he wanted to foster hunger and thirst. He wanted people to keep searching rather than to take some information away with them. And so big questions are so incredibly valuable in our faith journey and in our prayer spaces as well. I suspect that any of us could have written this big question, yeah? Why don't you reply? There are always some funny questions, and I'm always on the lookout for these. This is an exceptionally good one. Why did you make wasps and flies? Now, on a number of occasions, people have tried to persuade me that wasps are useful. I still am not convinced, but hey, there we go. And this one, I particularly like this one. This was from a primary school. A little boy wrote, "What was the first crisps called?" I'm not sure that God had anything to do with this, but there you go. It is a big question. I'm bringing this to a close now, just to look at a few things that students have said as a result of their experience in a prayer space in their school. This was a boy who, having in a high school, having experienced the prayer space and having been asked, "What did you like?" wrote this: "I liked everything because it let me open myself and be me, not something that's not me." What a profound bit of a kind of self-reflection there. I've realized that most of the time I'm not me, but when I was here, when I was in this prayer space, I felt like I could be me. What a gift that prayer space was for him. I love this one too. It made me feel good about myself. Did that child or that young person have a great revelation about God? Did they leave the room feeling like their faith life had suddenly expanded? I have no idea. But they felt good about themselves. And do you know what? My hunch is that heaven was in absolute uproar. I imagine heaven was just full of dancing and cheering because that child, for whom the great battleground is how they feel about themselves, has been won just a little bit that day. And prayer spaces, we've already mentioned this, they're just so valuable for children and young people who are suffering with grief. And I suspect in the wake of this year, when we've all become that little bit or that lot more aware of suffering and death, I think simple, creative ways to help children and young people process the death, the suffering that they've experienced, or they've just been more aware of because it's there hovering within the news and on social media a lot more. I think these prayer spaces, these reflection spaces are going to be so much more valuable. And for many children and young people, I could tell you story after story after story of children and young people who have had what you can only describe as a revelation, something profound, an epiphany. They've seen something that they've never seen before, as a result of their experience in that simple prayer space, the post-it notes and the torn up cardboard, and the presence of God has somehow brought about a dramatic change. So, what do you do next? For those of you who are considering your next steps to running prayer spaces, all I've done really is just given an overview of what takes place in a prayer space. There's loads more detailed information on the prayer spaces in schools website, but the first thing I would recommend that you do is pray. Talk with God about it, but pour out what is it that you are hoping for, what is it that you're wanting to achieve. Start there, talk with God about it. It's remarkable what doors God opens, what connections God seems to foster as a result of us talking with God about this. Second thing, do explore the website. And hot tip for you, the Prayer Spaces in Schools website is in the process of a massive redesign. It will relaunch probably middle of April. It's pretty good as it is, but it's going to be 100 times better. So do explore the website. And if there's a 9-step guide on there to how to get started with your first prayer space. There are loads of stories of prayer spaces that have happened, and there are tons of free downloadable resources on there. If you can visit a prayer space, I appreciate that right now it's pretty difficult to do that. But do get in touch with us. That's one of the reasons that we try to stay in touch with those who are running prayer spaces is because we love, wherever possible, to connect local people up with people who aren't too far away, who might be able to offer some more specialist and nearby help. So do get in touch with us and we'll do our best to help you visit another prayer space. Build good relationships, or build on good relationships. Whenever churches get in touch with us and say, we want to run a prayer space, how do we get started? Our first question in response is always, have you already got a good relationship with your local school? And if not, are you committed to a long-term relationship? Are you committed to ongoing serving and blessing, seeking first the kingdom of heaven in partnership with them? If not, please don't do a prayer space. Do something else. Bake cakes for the teachers. Go and do some assemblies. Do something else that requires a little bit less trust and effort and energy. A prayer space is quite hard work. It's incredibly valuable and incredibly exciting, but it is quite hard work. And so it's really important that you build this prayer space on a good relationship with a local school. Then you want to get thinking about the dates and the location, which room, which space within the school building. Then get on to choosing the prayer activities. And as I said, on our website, there are probably 150 different prayer activities, and also some guidelines on how to choose the right kind of prayer activities. You remember the grid that I explained earlier. Try to use a selection of activities from all 4 of those areas, and don't sort of make it fully lent into one of those 4 areas. Then you want to recruit and train your team. We say this all the time, designing the prayer space, choosing your prayer activities, that's the easy bit. It really is the easy bit, because it's all been done for you. It's been done hundreds of times, and there's loads of tried and tested resources. The really tough bit, and the bit where the magic really happens, is in the recruiting of your team. Recruit the best possible team you can. They are the best gift that you will give to your local school. Recruit people who are hospitable, who are confident but not pushy, who are good listeners. You don't want a team of over enthusiastic evangelists, if I can put it that way. You want people who are good listeners, who are safe presence. Choose a couple of grandparents. My experience is grandparents are brilliant on prayer spaces in schools teams, because they kind of exude that sense of peace and slow and good listening. And frankly, for a lot of children and young people, grandparents are missing from their lives. And those figures, those personalities are incredibly valuable. Register your prayer space. Please let us know. As I said, it really helps us to sort of know what's happening where, and it also helps us because we can or it's going to help you because we can connect you up with others. And it's remarkable how many times we hear from people running prayer spaces, and yet there's 1-2 miles down the road who they don't know about. And it's great to be able to join forces and learn from one another's experiences and share resources and all that kind of thing. Prepare well, publicize well. Bear in mind that you're publicizing not only to the pupils but to the staff and perhaps parents as well. And this is where you need to work closely in partnership with the school staff as to how you build up to the prayer space. Obviously, you host a fantastic prayer space, and please let me point back to the Prayer Space in Schools website. Again, there are lesson plans on there. There's safeguarding guidelines. There's stuff to do with confidentiality on there. There's how to fill in a health and safety form. There's all sorts of materials that will help you run a fantastic prayer space on where you are. And then finally, there's that what next, which I've inferred right from the beginning. The prayer space isn't the end point. It's a catalyst. It's a funnel. It's it's a vehicle. It's something that will reveal, it will take a snapshot of what's going on in the lives of children and young people in that school, and it will provide something really valuable for the staff and for you as volunteers of the local church to be able to serve in an ongoing way. So we would always recommend a kind of post prayer space debrief, where you just talk about what have you observed, what were the big themes, what were the big questions, what was written on the empty chair tags, what were the things that came up over the course of that week, and what can we do to continue to serve and bless and seek first the kingdom of heaven together in partnership. So that's what the Prayer Space in Schools website looks like at the moment. It's going to change, but that's the place to go to get all your resources right now. And so this is my final slide. It's 50 minutes, so I've got to wrap up right now. But these 3 questions I would like to leave you with. What's in your head? What are the enduring thoughts and questions you have now, having heard all of this? What's in your heart? What are you feeling? And finally, what is in your hands? What do you need to do next practically? And I'd invite you to think about those 3 questions, maybe write some things down, and please get in touch with us if there's any way that you think we can continue to serve you and support you. There's lots more that could be said, but I'm going to draw it to a close there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can work out how to do that. There we go. Stop share. Boom. There we go. So thank you so much for joining us with this seminar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Joined Up conference. Bye-bye, everybody.